The festival that forgot its people. I arrived at the village square just as the lanterns flickered to life. But the cobblestones beneath my feet pulsed faintly, like the ground itself remembered everyone who had ever walked here. A procession began, though no one appeared at first, shadows slinking across the square, twisting into humanoid shapes, limbs bending impossibly. Drums sounded from nowhere, each beat warping the air, rippling the lantern light into molten reds and greens that dripped like wax across the walls. The festival stalls groaned, painted banners curling like tongues, their letters stretching into grotesque symbols that whispered warnings I could almost read. I stepped closer to a fountain, water black and viscous, rippling with faces pressed against the surface, mouths opening and closing silently. Children appeared briefly, their faces elongated, eyes stacked vertically, mouths moving in patterns that weren't language but demanded comprehension. A masked dancer twirled past, body stretching unnaturally, arms bending backward, fingers curling into shapes that scratched the air in miniature hieroglyphs. Lanterns overhead swayed, dripping black liquid that formed writhing figures, twisting into miniature versions of the festival itself. Music rose, accordion notes distorted, bending reality, each tone vibrating in my bones, making the cobblestones pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Stumbled forward, and a shadow detached itself from a building, folding over itself, extending impossibly long limbs to brush against my coat. The villagers, if they were even alive, appeared warped, faces melting into masks, limbs bending into angles that should have broken bones. A goat trotted past, but its legs split and reformed like ribbons. Head tilting impossibly, eyes rotating, teeth stacked in layers. The fountain shuddered, splashing shadows onto the square, and I saw hundreds of tiny hands crawling across the cobblestones toward me. I stepped on one, and it pulsed, warm, compressing against my skin like the memory of someone else's touch, whispering names I had never heard. A food stall trembled, bread splitting open to reveal miniature screaming faces, eyes blinking independently, mouths shaping words I couldn't speak. The square twisted slightly, the buildings bending inward, leaning toward the center, as if the village itself was alive, folding in around me. A masked musician played a flute, though the instrument stretched impossibly, the notes bending into colors that dripped across my vision. I turned a corner, and the alley behind me folded backward, repeating infinitely, each repetition slightly more grotesque than the last. Lantern light pooled into the cracks between cobblestones, forming tiny mouths, whispering fragments of memories and prayers I did not know. A shadow of myself appeared in the center of the square, stepping forward independently, gesturing toward the fountain with hands that elongated and split. The crowd, shadows, reflections, twisted faces, moved in unison, folding in and out of each other, forming grotesque patterns that pulsed like living fabric. A cat slinked along the edges of the square, but its head rotated like a wheel, eyes stacked vertically, tongue curling into impossible spirals. The drums beat faster, the ground vibrating, the lanterns dripping, and I felt the festival itself breathing, exhaling whispers, recording me. A masked dancer tripped, limbs folding into impossible shapes, then rose again, its body bending in ways that seemed to defy physics entirely. The fountain water began to rise, forming small tendrils, wrapping around the legs of statues, pulsing in rhythm with the cobblestones beneath my feet. I tried to leave, but the alleys twisted, folding like origami, paths leading back to the center, where the shadows waited, beckoning, pulsing. A lantern fell, shattering into shapes that crawled, forming miniature masks that grinned impossibly wide, faces stacked atop each other. I stumbled into the main square again, and the villagers, all twisted, elongated, folding, stepped toward me. La, bowing, gesturing silently, recording my every move. Finally, I fled through an archway, and the festival square vanished behind me, replaced by empty streets, yet I felt it in my chest, pulsing, remembering, waiting. Even now, the colors of the lanterns bleed across my vision. The whispers echo in my mind, and I know the festival will remember me until the next visitor arrives. The lake that swallowed voices. I arrived at the lake at twilight, the water black and still, yet ripples formed where nothing moved. The reeds bent inward, whispering names I had never heard, their rustle like a choir of unseen mouths. I knelt at the shore, and the water pulsed, faintly warm, pressing against my palms as if tasting my skin. A reflection appeared, not my own, but dozens of faces layered atop each other, mouths opening and closing without sound. I tried to speak, but my voice emerged distorted, split across multiple echoes, none matching my lips. The air smelled of wet earth and iron, thick enough to taste, curling around me like fingers. A fish jumped, but its body stretched impossibly, eyes stacked vertically, ticating, mouth opening into multiple screams simultaneously. The ripples across the lake merged, forming shapes that resembled people bending, twisting, leaning toward me from beneath the surface. A tie reached forward, and a hand emerged, not flesh, but water shaped like flesh, pressing into mine with faint warmth. The shore shifted slightly, sinking underfoot, rising elsewhere, as if the lake remembered every step I had taken. A boat appeared, drifting silently, but inside, shadows moved, gesturing, whispering in tongues I almost understood. I stepped closer, and the water exhaled faint waves, carrying voices, memories of those who had lingered, some screaming, some laughing. The reeds twitched, forming faint letters, spelling warnings I could almost comprehend but couldn't hold in my mind. A duck glided across the water, its body rippling like liquid metal, eyes spinning, following my every move. I knelt again, trying to leave, but the water reflected a different shore, a different village, inhabited by shadows that mirrored my gestures. A wave lapped at my feet, pulling my toes into its grip, twisting slightly, leaving faint impressions in the sand. The sky reflected in the lake pulsed like skin, colors shifting green to black to faint red, faces forming in the clouds. A flock of birds rose, but their wings bent impossibly, feathers curling into letters that spelled warnings I could almost read. I stepped into the lake, and the water held me lightly, then heavier, pulling gently downward, whispering in overlapping voices. The reflections around me multiplied, twisting into grotesque versions of myself, each one gesturing, pointing, screaming silently. A fish swam past, its body morphing into a small hand that reached from my ankle, soft and warm, then dissolved back into water. I looked toward the village, and the buildings bent impossibly, leaning into the lake, their shadows curling like fingers across the surface. The reeds now moved like snakes, coiling, lifting slightly from the ground, brushing my arms. Pressing messages I could not fully understand. I tried to leave, but the shoreline had folded in on itself, its paths looping impossibly, shadows tugging at my feet, guiding me forward. A lantern floated across the water, dripping black liquid that formed miniature screaming faces, each one opening and closing its mouth in silent agony. The lake pulsed, rhythmically, exhaling warmth and whispers, pressing memories into me, imprinting, marking, claiming something. I turned to step back, and the water reflected not the shore, but a field of countless hands reaching upward, stretching toward me. A ripple passed, and my reflection blinked independently, lips moving, whispering secrets I could almost understand. I stumbled onto the shore finally, the water still pulsing faintly, carrying echoes of voices in hands that would never forget me. Even now, I feel it beneath my skin, the lake remembering, swallowing, holding, and waiting for the next hand. The next voice, the next shadow, the hotel that eats your senses. The lobby was empty, yet the chandelier above twisted in impossible spirals, stripping shadows instead of light, each bulb flickering like a heartbeat. The carpet rippled beneath my feet, swallowing my shoes, then spitting them back slightly smaller, as if measuring me. I touched the wall, and it was soft, squishy, pulsing beneath my fingers like living skin, veins faintly glowing in colors I could not name. A bellhop appeared from nowhere, its face smooth except for eyes that reflected scenes from rooms I had never entered. I stepped toward the elevators, and the floor shivered, splitting into geometric patterns that swallowed air and light simultaneously. The buttons glowed faintly, but pressing them only made the panel bend inward, folding over itself like taffy, leaving my finger trapped for a moment. The air smelled like burnt sugar and iron, thick enough to taste. And every inhale brought flashes of memories that weren't mine. I stepped inside the elevator, which had no doors, and the walls began stretching outward, twisting like soft clay, creating new floors I could not have imagined. A mirror appeared, reflecting me with elongated limbs. A second head that whispered my name softly, a tongue curling into shapes I could not read. The elevator hummed, each note bending in frequencies I could feel in my bones, vibrating memories I had long forgotten or never lived. I tried to exit on the 5th floor, but the hallway was a Mobius strip, looping endlessly, doors shifting positions with every step. One door opened, revealing a room filled with water, but the reflection showed not my face, but dozens of me screaming silently from inside the walls. I backed out, and the hallway stretched behind me, floorboards flexing like lungs, its walls breathing in slow, deliberate rhythm. A carpet rolled itself up, forming a snake-like shape, hissing in a language I almost understood, winding around my ankles, but never constricting. The ceiling melted downward in places, dripping a thick, viscous liquid that resembled wax, skin, and paint simultaneously. I stumbled into a lounge, where chairs floated slightly above the ground, their shadows crawling independently along the walls. A painting on the wall warped, figures stepping out, limbs bending impossibly, mouths moving silently in twisted conversations. The bar counter rippled, the glasses forming faces that blinked, teeth gnashing, whispering promises of experiences I could not refuse. I tried to leave, but the hallway rotated, folding on itself, floor becoming ceiling, walls merging into corridors that had never existed. The scent of burning metal and wet earth filled my nose, thickening as the air pulled at my clothes, tugging me forward into unknown rooms. I stepped into a dining room, and the table stretched endlessly. Plates curling like tiny galaxies, food pulsing as if alive, faces screaming silently in the fruit. A chandelier descended, dripping black liquid that formed hands reaching upward, grasping for objects, people, memories, none of which were mine. I tried to scream, but my voice split into dozens of whispers, echoing from the ceiling, floor, and walls, overlapping into a single unbearable chorus. The carpet unrolled, folding into my feet, pulling me forward, and the chairs rose, forming towers that leaned impossibly, threatening to topple. I fell to my knees, and the walls around me melted into a single, continuous surface, a liminal space stretching infinitely in every direction. The elevator doors reappeared, glowing faintly, but stepping inside twisted me, elongating limbs, duplicating my reflection in impossible symmetry. The bellhop returned, now dozens, faces blurred, bodies bending in impossible ways, each one bowing slowly, silently insisting I follow. I ran through hallways that twisted like ribbons, staircases looping in infinite spirals, doors leading into rooms that reflected my own memory back at me, distorted. Finally, I stumbled into the lobby, chandelier dripping shadows, carpet writhing, walls pulsing. Yet outside the windows, nothing moved. The city continued, perfectly still. I exited through the revolving doors, and the air outside felt normal for the first time. Yet the echo of the hotel's pulse remained in my chest, waiting for the next visitor. The market that eats shadows. The street was empty, yet every shop sign flickered with movement that shouldn't exist, letters writhing like living creatures. I noticed my shadow first. It lagged behind, stretched too long, then split into three, each one moving independently. A fruit vendor's stall bulged unnaturally, oranges swelling and breathing, skins rippling with faint faces whispering names I had never heard. I tried to step past, and one shadow lunged forward, twisting into a grotesque hand that brushed my leg and recoiled instantly. The cobblestones beneath my feet pulsed softly, rising and sinking in patterns that felt like lungs inhaling and exhaling. A fishmonger's tank overflowed, water sloshing upward, fish elongating into human shapes before collapsing back into fluid, leaving ripples shaped like screaming mouths. Tea lights bent toward me, casting shadows that moved on their own, curling along the walls, merging and splitting in impossible sequences. I passed a bakery, its windows bulging outward like eyes, steam forming faces that blinked, lips moving silently as if trying to speak. A cart tipped over, spilling vegetables that squirmed like worms, peeling themselves open to reveal tiny screaming faces beneath their skin. Every shop now pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, the shadows inside stretching outward, reaching toward me, tugging at my coat, my hands, my thoughts. The air grew thick with a metallic sweetness, and I realized my reflection in a puddle had already stepped ahead of me. I tried to run, but the street folded in on itself, cobblestones bending, buildings tilting impossibly, and my shadows danced over walls like living paint. A clock tower chimed, though it had no hands, and the sound echoed backward, reversing my footsteps, my breath, my thoughts. A butcher's knives began to float, carving the air in intricate patterns that spelled letters I could not comprehend. The shadows converged into a single grotesque figure, hunched, faceless, with hands that flicked and snapped like skeletal branches. I ducked into a narrow alley, but the walls were no longer brick. They rippled like water, reflecting dozens of versions of myself, all screaming. Lanterns hanging above twisted into coils, dripping black wax that formed small creatures, wriggling and crawling toward my feet. I reached the end of the alley, only to see it stretch endlessly, the market repeating infinitely, each version more distorted than the last. A shadow leaped at me, and when I blinked, it had replaced my own, dragging my body toward a stall I had never noticed. The merchant smiled, impossibly wide, teeth stacked in layers, eyes spiraling, offering a fruit that pulsed as if it had a heartbeat of its own. I touched it, and the shadows screamed, curling into my skin, leaving traces of things I had not yet lived, but would remember forever. The buildings themselves began to breathe, expanding and contracting. Windows blinking like eyes, chimneys exhaling whispers in unrecognizable language. I turned, and all the streets behind me had vanished, replaced by a single shadow stretching infinitely toward the horizon. The wind carried laughter that split into hundreds of voices, overlapping, pressing into my ears, forming words I almost understood. A fruit from the vendor rolled toward me on its own, splitting open to reveal a miniature version of the street, shadows writhing inside. I stumbled backward, the cobblestones melting into black liquid, pulling at my boots, tugging me toward the center of the market. The air thickened, heavy with eyes watching, colors impossible to name swirling around me, each shadow twisting in response to my panic. I tried to scream, but my voice emerged as dozens of whispers, repeating my name in high, overlapping tones, pressing into my mind. The market collapsed in on itself suddenly, folding into a single point, and I was pulled inside, my shadow stretching, splitting, dissolving into the air. When I opened my eyes, the street was empty again, perfectly still. Yet my shadow lingered in impossible angles, waiting, pulsing, remembering.